We resume with the last paper from this panel, a paper by Samantha Besson and José Martí, No International Democratic Representation Without Sovereignty. And I think José Luis is doing the presentation, right?
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much to Samantha for organizing this. This is a great conference. And I'm always thrilled to be here. Well, I say always, but it's my second time only to be here at the Collège de France. It's actually an honor, actually, to be here. So, first of all, our apologies for the length of the paper, especially to the commentator. We always try to keep it short, and this time we swear that we were going to write it shorter, and finally, we always want to say too many things. So as for the presentation, I will try to speak about 5 things. Probably I will be very quick on the 4th one, the one on sovereignty, and then, of course, we are happy to discuss it later at greater length later. But let me just have a not so brief introduction about some kind of background remarks. So first of all, I will be very quick on the first slide. After 1 day and a half of discussions about the representation in, through, and by IOs, I think we are all fully aware that the stakes are very high here. IOs make law or contribute to make international law. They have a large role in those processes, and therefore the issue about whether, to what extent and in what conditions they can be regarded as representatives, it turns to be a very relevant question. Also, as a kind of background remarks, we always try to insist that if we approach the international system from the lens of democratic legitimacy, we can actually spot several important deficits in the democratic representation of peoples everywhere in the system, and also particularly in IOs. We hope that maybe this view that IOs might be representative might come to help to alleviate some of these deficits. And we always find that there are many shortcomings in the traditional view that says that IOs particularly should be regarded as representing states and not peoples. We are glad actually that here in this conference at least there was widespread agreement that IOs, when we see them as representative, they should represent peoples and not states. And that was the case also of some papers presented yesterday that are, let me call it that way, statist. So they try to defend the role of the states as the main representatives of peoples. And still, nevertheless, Francis or Philip or some of you have actually conceded that IOs might also represent peoples, which is actually not so common in the contemporary literature, but this is actually one of the claims that we want to defend. So the kind of questions that we use in the paper to articulate the sections of the papers are these 3. So first of all, why IOs should be regarded as representative. And this connects with a number of general discussions about legitimacy, representation, so things that we have been discussing at length here. So the concrete question might be, why should IOs be regarded as representative? But more specifically, why should they be regarded as democratically representative? And I will try to explain briefly the reasons we find to say that they should. But this is only actually the kind of first step to the 2 central questions that we try to address in the paper. And this is where we try to make some kind of new claims or contributions that are not, we don't see sufficiently well defended in the literature. One is the central question of who should IOs represent. I anticipated that we want to say that they should represent peoples, not states. But we take a step farther, and we want to say that they should represent publics, which is not exactly the same thing as peoples. And actually, it allows us to have a more complex, but also richer understanding of IOs as representatives. And finally, probably the central question is, how should IOs represent? And this allows us actually to connect this with representation theory, and more specifically with the 2 dominant views in the literature of international law, the views of how IOs might be regarded as representative that I will present later. So let me also say that this connects with a previous work that Samantha and I have been doing in the last 5 years. We have a longer project. At some point, eventually, we might come up having a book. Probably the central contribution there was actually the first paper we did together, published in 2018, The Legitimate Actors of International Lawmaking, towards a theory of international democratic representation. In this larger analysis that we try to develop in this longer project, and hopefully eventually at some point it will be a book, there should be a central place for IOs regarded as representative. They are not the only representatives for sure, but they should have a role, or so they claim in the paper. The argument might be summarized. The argument in this chapter might be summarized as follows. The protection of self-government and equal political autonomy, which we regard as central democratic values, against equal political autonomy against domination and the dispersal of growing power of IOs require, according to us, the public reinstitution of IOs in international law so that they can represent the peoples of the world, and not only their member states, and so that they can do so democratically and not only instrumentally. Democratic representation by IOs also requires organizing their sharing of external sovereignty. Sovereignty is also crucial to our argument, even if I will not spend too much time defending this in the presentation, but it's in the paper, and we can discuss it in the Q&A. And more specifically, this argument is a call for reform of the current international law of representation by IOs, including its functional democratic ambivalence for more input legitimacy on the one hand, and the private law analogies behind its agency-based and incorporation-based. These are the two dominant views that we want to discuss, and we actually want to combine. It's not that we oppose them entirely, to representation for more public legitimacy on the other. We think that our argument is specific or distinctive in 3 grounds. The first one is a multiple approach, right? So we want to defend this multiple idea that, so the system, the international system as a whole, and IOs in particular, they should allow for multiple representation of the peoples, right? Avoiding the kind of monist view that is classic, that is traditional, and the traditional monist view would say that only states can represent the peoples, right? In that sense, it's monist. We claim for expanding that view and multiplying the nature and the kind of representatives that might represent the peoples. Second, our approach is systemic. So despite the fact that it's multiple, and we claim for multiplying the number of representatives, we still think that it's essential actually to grant coherence, the coherence of the system. That is a complex task. It's not easy. Someone referred to that yesterday. We say that this should be addressed on a case-by-case basis. We can discuss about examples later. But in any case, we think it's essential, at least as an aspirational element in the theory, it's essential to try to grant coherence, both at the level of the international system and more particularly in IOs, and also when we try to analyze the role of IOs when they can represent by themselves. And finally, the theory, perhaps this is the most distinctive feature, the theory is importantly institutional in different senses, right? But perhaps the most important ones is that for us, something that is essential, I will try to argue for that in a minute. What is essential is to regard representatives as institutions that might institute different publics in different ways. And this institutional dimension, actually, we find it's neglected. It's widely neglected by many existing theories of international representation. For us, it's crucial to maintain it. So let me go for the first question. Why should IOs be regarded as legitimate, as representative? Here we start discussing briefly, but importantly, we start discussing the concept of legitimacy and why we think it is connected with democratic legitimacy. So we are here concerned about normative legitimacy, not descriptive one, right? So it's a normative question, and we actually discussed this also yesterday in respect to other papers. So we are interested actually in evaluating to what extent IOs might be doing a good job today in representing the peoples of the world. And as we anticipated yesterday, our conclusion is that they are not doing a good job, which is, if you want to be optimistic, it's good news, right? So there's ample room for reform and improvement. Second, the notion of legitimacy that we have is distinct from justice. I know that this is, as Terry was saying this morning, this is complicated. There are too many notions of legitimacy out there. But I think that in political philosophy, at least today, perhaps with some exceptions, Rosan Ballon yesterday, and a few others, but the majoritarian position is that legitimacy is one thing, justice is another, right? And it's not always easy to demarcate the distinction here, but it clearly refers to two different things. You might, perhaps the easiest way to put the distinction is that justice concerns the substantive quality of decisions, right? You need a theory of justice to assess whether a particular decision or a law is correct in this normative sense, while legitimacy mostly refers to procedural issues, not exclusively procedural, but is more procedural than justice, and that's why in the paper actually we call it procedural justice. But again, I mean, the terminology here, it's kind of a mess in the discussion, so I think we should avoid discussions about words and labels, and just try to make sure that we are doing a decent job in explaining what we mean by the terms, and not, perhaps it doesn't make sense to waste too much time actually claiming that this is the correct understanding of one word or another. Something that we also assume in the paper, this is pretty widespread, I think that we are not saying anything special or controversial, is that legitimacy should be regarded as the right to rule, right? So when you have a particular system, political system, if you say that this system is legitimate, what you're saying is that those institutions have the right to rule over the subjects, those who are subject to the rules of the system. This is, again, in the philosophical discussion, I think this is like a very minimalist idea that almost everyone might accept. And of course, you have different theories that explain where this legitimacy comes from, this right to rule, where it comes from, or which are the consequences of saying that this in particular institution has a right to rule. But in any case, the core meaning would be that. And then there is this other very relevant distinction that has been, of course, not surprisingly, it has arisen in all these discussions, the distinction between input legitimacy and output legitimacy. And you know, output legitimacy would basically hold that the legitimacy of a decision or the legitimacy of an institution depends on whether this institution or that law or that decision actually delivers good outputs, good outcomes, typically assessed from the point of view of justice, but you might actually adopt other kinds of criteria or standards to assess the quality of those outcomes. But you need an independent standard, of course, to assess the quality of the outcomes. And then, so an output legitimacy theory would basically claim that the legitimacy of the institution entirely depends on whether the outcomes are adequate or normatively acceptable. We don't object to the idea that outcomes are relevant. We have been discussing these in several papers. They are crucial. We think that a theory of legitimacy that neglects the importance of outcomes or outputs would be incomplete. It would be nonsense, actually. I think that nobody would claim that. So outcomes are always important, but they are insufficient. So the only thing we say in the paper regarding this is that we cannot have a complete theory of legitimacy if we forget entirely about inputs. So inputs are relevant for a number of reasons. Some of them were raised yesterday as well. Self-government, self-determination, the importance for peoples to, because we are talking about autonomous peoples, to make their own views and their own claims about the things that need to be decided. So actually what we say is even at the domestic level, where output legitimacy is also having some kind of popularity now, even at the domestic level, we would never say that input legitimacy is irrelevant, right? Of course, what you can say, if you're an output-driven theorist, what you can say is that all what matters, or the most important things, are outputs. And therefore, when you assess the question of which kind of inputs, which kind of procedure, so if you see outcomes as what are the decisions to be made, what they should be from a substantive point of view, and you oppose that question to the two central questions to input legitimacy, which are the questions of who should make decisions and how these decisions should be made. What you might say, if you're an output-driven theorist, what you might say is the answer to those questions of who and how we should make decisions should be entirely instrumental to the question of which decisions should be made and how we can make sure that the correct decisions are made. But we think we try to claim in the paper that even at the domestic level, nobody would say that the who and how decisions should be made is exclusively dependent, instrumentally dependent on these outcomes, because there are many considerations that are relevant there as to how we can give proper voice to everyone and equal say to everyone, and so on and so forth. These are actually the reasons that we connect with democratic legitimacy, and we take to be non-controversial. I know that we had some discussion yesterday, but we take to be non-controversial the idea that legitimacy depends at least in part, perhaps not exclusively, but at least in part and importantly, on democracy. So, in other words, authoritarian regimes, and I know that it's not so easy to distinguish between authoritarian and democratic regimes. It might be a matter of degree. All the discussions we had yesterday, I will not go there. But authoritarian regimes, and we can stick to the clearest examples, the extreme examples of authoritarian regimes, they are regarded as illegitimate, and the main reason is that they are not democratic. So, of course, all the question, as Yves was trying to push yesterday, the relevant question here is what we mean by democracy. And here again in the paper, we're not trying to make very bold statements or claims, because that's not the main focus in the paper. What we try to stick is to a minimalist notion of democracy, one that can be widely shared by democratic theorists of different kinds. And basically, we identify four basic principles. The principle of ultimate effective popular control, or self-government, if you want. As I said yesterday, we take this from the Republican views and more directly from Philippe Petit's view. You don't need actually to agree with Petit to be with us in the paper. I think that there is a minimalist understanding of this principle of ultimate effective control that is more modest than the claims that Philip makes, but it's widely shareable or acceptable. Then the principle of political equality, which is central to democracy, the principle of deliberative contestability. One perhaps important remark is that the principle of ultimate effective popular control affects the system as a whole, right? So that doesn't mean that individuals or the peoples should have effective means of control over every decision or every particular institution or process that is taking place, but it needs to be guaranteed in respect to the whole system, to the generality of the system. The principle of deliberative contestability works different. Here, basically, the idea is that people should have means to contest in a deliberative way every single decision that is issued by the system or by the institutions in the system. And finally, a principle of human rights protection, which is, of course, substantive, but very minimalist again. So we think that these four principles might be widely shared. That's what we try in the paper, at least, not to rely on a notion of democracy that might be very controversial. By the way, you should not take this to be our preferred version of democracy, ideal theory of democracy. We might have a much more demanding one. We actually have a much more demanding one. But again, here the strategy is just to stick to a minimalist notion. How am I doing? Oh, terrible. When we apply those four principles of democratic legitimacy to iOS, so the idea here is that if the principle of self-government or ultimate effective control, popular control, is fully compatible with the idea of representation. Actually, we don't see representation even as a second best. We think that representation is inherent to democratic arrangements. So there's nothing wrong with having representation, but what is important is actually to preserve, if you want to preserve, let's call it popular sovereignty or self-government, what is important, what is crucial then, is to preserve this idea of ultimate control. The people need to be in ultimate control. Otherwise, your representation cannot be called democratic. When we apply these principles to IOs, and more specifically to the question of whether IOs can be regarded as representative, what we think is key here is to understand that IOs, in effect, they can be regarded as representative of some subjects. We will discuss later whose subjects, but what you need to preserve here is the idea that the represented, as long as you want this representation to be democratic, the represented need to have effective means of authorization, ex ante or ex post authorization, and ultimate control. These are the two key conditions. And this connects with some remark that we might want to discuss later. It's very common today to say that the democratization of international organizations and the international system should be done through allowing more different types of actors, non-state actors, to participate in one way, in some role, in decision-making processes, and also by strengthening the deliberative nature of those decision-making processes. We have nothing against this, right? So we actually have defended this in previous works. This should be done, particularly in relation to the principles of deliberative contestability, and also regarding participation. You might find an argument based on political equality for a greater inclusion, right? So to make more visible the voices of people that might be underrepresented or might not be visible enough. So all this is important. We are not saying it's not. What we say in the paper is that it's insufficient to ground a proper theory of democratic representation by IOs. So we should have this, but we should also have, and that's even more central, authorization and control. Let me just skip some of the parts. So what do we mean by representation? Here again, so you know, there are many, many theories of representation, but what we try to do in the paper is start with a very minimalist notion, one that might be shared by any view of representation today. And this is the one that you have here in the slide. A relation between two entities, agents. This is tricky, a little bit complicated. Let me just skip it now. A relation between two entities, agents, in which one of them, the representative, should take into account and promote the interests of the other, the represented. This is compatible with the standing for view, the acting for view, the incorporationist view, the agent-based view, the constructivist view. All the theories of representation are compatible with this minimalist notion. In the paper, we identify the dominant views today as actually related to two old views. They are actually medieval views, conceptions of representation, which they both come from private law, but as we said yesterday regarding Anne, that as itself doesn't disqualify the views. It's just a historical point that they come from private law. And one of them actually is too much stuck to the privatist vision, but that's a separate argument. It's not the origins what makes a problem here. One is the incorporation-based representation, and the other, the agency-based representation. I will come back to this. And the conception of democratic representation we want to defend is directly extracted from the four principles of democratic legitimacy. So what we try to defend here is that proper democratic representation, so normatively acceptable, is a relation that institutes, authorizes, and holds power accountable under the ultimate control. Accountability here is also tricky. If we have time, we can discuss it in the Q&A. And holds power accountable in this sense of preserving the ultimate control by the people, and hence contributes to the justification of political authority, including of lawmaking authority. It gives the representative a claim to act as or for the represented, leading to the attribution of those acts if the conditions of authorization and control are fulfilled. Now, let me go to the two central questions. Who IOs should represent, and what does this representation mean? What kind of relationship it creates or should create? Who should represent? Well, the traditional response is IOs should represent states, member states, right? As I said, we are glad that here there's, I don't know if unanimity, but widespread agreement that it should represent the peoples. That's a big step, actually. Not everybody agrees with that. But the traditional view says that IOS should represent states, and the main reason is based on the idea of a state sovereignty. That's why sovereignty needs to be brought into the discussion. And we are also glad that Philip did it yesterday, because we think that an important part of the argument depends on that, even if I will not have time to go into the details there. Now, the main problem we have there is that states have proven to be not very good in representing the peoples of the world, for a number of reasons. In previous works, we have identified how many? Seven shortcomings, maybe, or 8 shortcomings of states as representatives of the people, as legitimate representatives of the people. Let me just mention a couple of them. So one of them was already mentioned yesterday, and it's obvious, right? So not all states are democratic. And I know this is a difference of degree, and even the most democratic ones, Norway, Iceland, whatever, they are far from perfect, and they all have problems. But the truth is that some states are clearly not democratic, and by no means they can be said that they are representing their peoples legitimately. That's perhaps the main problem, because one half of the states of the world are regarded as non-democratic. That's not the only problem. So, as I said, even democratic states, they have a lot of problems when they try to represent their peoples effectively. I think it was Anne who mentioned yesterday, international issues are not so visible in domestic politics, so domestic elections are perhaps not the best way to keep control over what your state is doing internationally. Also, there is the problem of stateless peoples, subnational minorities that might not be adequately represented. We can add to the list the representation of non-human animals or non-human beings, right, which are not nationals of any state, so they, of course, will never be adequately represented by states, and a number of other problems that I don't have time to discuss. So for us, this brings us to this classic idea that IOS should represent states, to another idea that I will not try to justify more, because again, we are in agreement here, I guess. It's the idea that IOS should represent the peoples, not states, but the peoples. From a systemic perspective of the international system, people should be represented because of the flaws, the shortcomings of the states representing the peoples, this monist view. Because of those shortcomings, we should have a much more open and multiple approach to representation, and we should welcome the idea that other states, other actors other than states might have a role in representing those peoples. And this might include also private actors, but this, let me leave it aside now. But centrally, it should include other public institutions, some of them subnational, regions or cities. But here, importantly, it includes IOS, right? So IOS should have their role in representing the peoples of the world, given that the states are not, if we see the states as the exclusive representatives, they are not doing a sufficiently good job. Also, partly because there is an identity between the subjects that should be represented by states and the subjects that should be represented by IOS. So IOS should represent the peoples, not the member states, as I said. And therefore, to the extent insofar as states are not representing adequately the peoples in the international system, then IOS should have a larger role in representing those peoples, maybe correcting the failures of states when they try to represent the peoples of the world. Here it's important to understand what we are doing in the paper is clearly non-ideal theory, right? So Samantha and I probably differ in our ideal theory of global democratic legitimacy. We have actually, for years, we have never discussed it properly. But that's not relevant. So the relevant thing is that we are in non-ideal circumstances. So you might still say, so let's take Philip or Francis as presenting the statist view at its best, right? So this is what the best you can expect from a state-based theory, or a democratic theory in Francis terms. That might be correct. I'm not sure whether we disagree, actually, on that basis. We might, but on different grounds, not basically in the paper, because our claim in the paper is that, in reality, states are not doing a good job. Therefore, we need to correct those failures. Francis, in response to one of my questions yesterday, he said, Maybe I'm just presenting a partial theory, I'm just focusing on democratic states, and he didn't present a solution for the problem of what we do with non-democratic states. And that's the question that we are mostly interested here, right? So what should we do to represent those peoples that are clearly underrepresented today? So our exercise is an exercise of non-ideal theory, for sure. And in that sense, maybe it's not so incompatible with Philippe's or Francis' view. So what we have defended in other works, and let me just go quick here. What we have defended in other works is the idea of a multiple institutional representation system that has these three features that I already mentioned before, so I will not repeat what I said yesterday, before. So it's a multiple view versus the monist traditional view. The systematic approach for us, it's crucial, and we oppose that to pluralism that also has been discussed in other papers. And it's publicly institutional as opposed to a privatist view of democratic representation. But I think that this will become clearer a little later. So we move from states to peoples in answering the question, 2 minutes? Okay. I'll stop here. No. Okay. Right. So we move from peoples to publics. We move from states to peoples, but also we try to defend the idea that we should move from peoples to publics. And by this we mean that, first of all, I already mentioned, we have many examples of stateless people, non-human beings, future peoples, future generations, many examples that are not fully covered by the idea of states, peoples, that might be covered by this wider notion of public, but also the idea that you might have different overlapping publics, like the citizens of a city or the citizens of a region, being represented by different actors in the international system, including by international organizations that might combine these different publics in different ways. Let me just skip this, and I will skip also the stuff on sovereignty. We can come back to that in the Q&A. And I go to the final point. So in the final section, section 3 of the paper, we address the two dominant views in the literature, when the small literature that we have that addresses the question of IOs as representatives. And we start criticizing the functionalist approach, which is very pervasive. The main arguments here are similar to the ones that I already mentioned when I presented the distinction between input legitimacy and output legitimacy. We have other arguments as well in the paper, but we can discuss this later. So let me just briefly say that the two dominant approaches in the literature today are the conventional or agency-based approach, so the principal-agent view, and the personal or incorporationist or incorporation-based approach. These are the two dominant views. Against the conventional or agency-based approach, basically we take all the objections that come from the discussion that has been already developed at the domestic level. There are many arguments. And they get worse when we try to apply this view, this approach, to the international system. I will mention just a couple of them, but I don't have time to go through all of them. But one of the important problems here is that the principal-agent view presupposes that we have a clearer understanding, pre-political understanding of who is the principal and who is the agent. And that's what we don't have at the international. We don't have it at the domestic level either, but clearly we don't have that at the international level. In contrast to that, we think that the relationship of representation is actually, and this is the positive part in the constructivist approach, it's a constructive process. Through the process of representing someone, you partially determine who is the principal and who is the agent through some kind of discursive process that was defended also here yesterday by Melissa and others. So this is one problem. Another problem is that this principal-agent view is usually conceptualized as one directional, right? Unidirectional. So it's the principal who tells the agent what to do, and that's deeply problematic in today's world, especially in the international system. But more importantly, this view is inherently private. It comes from private law, but it's inherently private in the sense that the same view, the principal-agent view that some people apply to IOs, might be applied to private representation, right? So states might hire a law firm or a company to represent them in some kind of forum on the same basis, exactly on the same basis. So it neglects what we take to be essential to democratic representation by IOs, which is this political dimension of representation that is not captured by the view of the agent-based approach. Nevertheless, we think that there are important things in that view that should be preserved. Against the incorporationist view, but basically what we say is that this incorporationist view, it is correct in taking the idea that there is a constitutive moment when we approach IOs as incorporating the member states or the peoples, as we say, the peoples in the process of representing them. This is correct, but then it neglects the idea that basically the idea derived from the principle of ultimate effective control, the idea that representation, democratic representation, requires an act of authorization and control. Because everything is exhausted by the act of constituting or incorporating the represented in the representative, and nothing else is relevant. That's a problem also with the constructivist view. They undermine or ignore or neglect the importance of permanent control and authorization. So basically what we do, I mean, we have other arguments, and of course I don't have time to go through them, but basically what we try to do in the paper is to say these two dominant views, they have captured relevant features of an adequate notion of democratic representation. And it's actually a mistake to believe that they are alternative views, because there is a way to combine them. And that's what we try to do in the paper. We try to advance a third view that tries to combine basically the instituting dimension of the personal incorporationist approach, even if limited, because we think that it falls short to the kind of institutional dimension that we want to defend, but we recognize that this incorporationist approach is good in identifying this institutional dimension. That should be combined with the authorizing and controlling dimension that you have in the agent-based or conventional approach. So we try to combine both approaches in the paper, and you will criticize us if we are not doing it well. So thank you very much.